since 2000, teaching in the areas of constitutional law, criminal procedure, civil rights, and election law. And of course, we're particularly interested in his passion for election law. He is a former civil rights lawyer for the U.S. Justice Department and former federal prosecutor who's tried a number of voting rights cases which went to the Supreme Court. His involvement in litigation over election law involves a number of cases that the League of Women Voters has followed very, very closely, including the challenge to the Palm Beach County, Florida butterfly ballot issue in 2000 presidential election, and the first federal case imposing cumulative voting as a non-district remedy for minority vote dilution under the Voting Rights Act. That was really hard to say. And finally, one that we were extremely involved with as a state league, and that was the court-ordered expansion of absentee mail-in voting during the 2020 pandemic in Tennessee. And that was a case that we were very pleased with the outcome when it was in that Chancery Court hearing. So with all that said, I will turn it over to Professor Mulroy. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you to Marianne for her help and to the League of Women Voters for giving me this opportunity to speak to you all. As Debbie said, I've been involved in a number of different cases and efforts in which the LWV has been an ally, and I have a lot of respect for the good that they do as an organization. I have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to switch over at that point, and then I won't be able to see you, but as has been noted, if you have a question, you can put it into the chat. I know that this is part of a series of presentations on redistricting, and you're going to be getting probably overlapping, if not duplicative, information about redistricting. And I will provide the basics on redistricting in this presentation, but I'd really like to approach it from a somewhat different perspective than most people that will do presentations for you. I want to suggest that there is a fundamental issue with the way that we do methods of election in the United States with respect to forcing a single member district construct onto everything. I think there's a better system. And I hope to get to that point and show you that by the end of the presentation. But let me begin by pointing out that a lot of the ideas that I'm going to be talking about today, I wrote about in my book, Rethinking U.S. Election Law, which is the title of this presentation. Of course, I've updated it for the upcoming round of redistricting, and I've tailored it more to Tennessee. So I have adapted it for our purposes today, but there are some of these ideas in the book itself. And I want to begin by pointing out, as I do in the book, three election results in recent years at the federal level that I consider to be anomalous. First, in 2016, as you all know, 3 million more Americans voted for Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump, and yet he became president. In 2012, nationwide, over 50%, almost 51% of the two-party vote went to Democratic candidates, but they gained only 46% of the seats. They lost the majority in the House by a 30-seat gap. And since only 1/3 of the US Senate is ever elected in a given election cycle, if you take the first 3 election cycles of the last decade, you have a similar situation in which the party that gets the majority of the vote nationwide does not get a majority control of the House. Now, before you think that I'm going to be doing a brief just for the Democratic Party and bashing Republicans, that's not the case. As I can tell you as we talk about this presentation, gerrymandering is something that happens by both Democrats and Republicans. When Democrats were in control in recent years in Maryland and Illinois, they drew gerrymandered district plans, just as I'm about to show you Republican-drawn gerrymandered district plans in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. At an earlier period in our history, the problem that I'm going to be talking to you about actually redounded to the benefit of the Democratic Party and was unfair to Republicans. Right now, it's the other way around. And what is this fundamental flaw that I'm talking about? It's whenever you subdivide the jurisdiction into small chunks, single member district chunks, and then have a winner-take-all election within each chunk, it can lead to disproportionate results. That is, it can lead to results that are different from the overall preference of all of the voters taken together in the jurisdiction. And this happens in a number of different ways. In the Electoral College, it happens. Just an example. Oops. In overwhelmingly blue states like New York and California, Hillary Clinton in 2016 ran up a supermajority, but every vote over 50% that she got was wasted because it's a winner-take-all system in the Electoral College. Whereas Donald Trump eked out bare majorities in more states and under the winner-take-all system in the Electoral College ended up getting more total votes. This is an example of what redistricting scholars will call packing, where you over-concentrate one party's votes in a couple of jurisdictions and they get way more votes than they need to control the majority, thus so-called wasting votes. Now, when we talk about gerrymandering in the redistricting plan, there's two main ways of gerrymandering: cracking and packing. Cracking is where you take a concentration of a particular party or a particular racial group and you draw the district lines across that concentration. You slash it in two. You chop their voting concentrations up into small pieces so that in no one district can they be a majority. Packing is the other side of that coin, where you stuff too many people of that party or that minority group into a district, you over-concentrate it, and thus you bleach the surrounding districts so that maybe they have one or two districts where they've got 70, 80, 90% majorities, but they don't have enough districts overall to control their fair share of the vote. So between packing and cracking, you can use gerrymandering to really skew the overall result away from the total preference of all of the voters in the jurisdiction. And there's no better example of that than the US House of Representatives. Since World War II, there's been an average of 6% of deviation between the percentage of votes nationwide that a political party gets, be it Democratic or Republican, and the percentage of seats in the House that they control. And the three examples I gave you at the beginning, my so-called anomalous results, are examples of what I call a counter-majoritarian skew. That is to say, it's really dramatic because the party that controls the majority of the vote doesn't control the majority of the seats. But it doesn't have to be as dramatic as that. It could be that a party does get a majority, but they get more seats than they should be entitled to, or fewer seats than they should be entitled to, based on their overall percentage of the vote jurisdiction-wide. This problem of a deviation between the percentage of votes that a party gets and the percentage of seats that a party gets has gotten worse in recent decades, as technology has gotten so advanced that you can slice and dice your districting maps down so well that you can do ever more subtle and ever more robust gerrymanders. Here's an example of an obvious one where the shape of the district itself screams to you that it is gerrymander. This is the Pennsylvania 7th Congressional District, drawn by Republicans in a very severe gerrymander against Democrats in the last round of redistricting. This district got the nickname of Goofy Kicking Donald Duck District. And I think if you take a look, you can see why they gave it that name. But gerrymanders don't have to be ugly. Gerrymanders actually can be quite lovely and compact. Take a look at this gerrymander in Wisconsin for the state legislature. The district map on the far left accurately reflected overall voter preference and had a slight majority for Democrats in the decade leading up to the 2010 redistricting. The one in the far right after the 2010 redistricting flipped that and gave the Republicans a majority, even though they were not a majority of the overall vote. That was the plan that went up to the US Supreme Court in Gill versus Wisconsin. I think almost all commentators agree that it was a gerrymander and that it was a deliberate use of district lines to skew the results in a way other than the overall voter preference. And yet, just to look at the district shapes, you wouldn't know it. So while compactness can be a sign of a gerrymander, it doesn't have to be non-compact districts in order for it to be a gerrymander. Okay, well, can we sue and get the courts to come to the rescue on this? Can we get the courts to save us, to stop these bad gerrymanders? And the answer is probably not. The Supreme Court has recently, in the last few years, declined to intervene in political gerrymandering. They're more than happy to intervene in racial gerrymandering, but if it's just plain old-fashioned Democrats screwing Republicans or Republicans screwing Democrats, they have held in a case called Rucho v. Common Cause that kind of claim is what is called a non-justiciable political question, which is a term of art meaning that it's the kind of political dispute that the courts have decided is peculiarly appropriate for the political branches, the popularly elected branches, the legislature and the executive, to deal with, and peculiarly inappropriate for courts to deal with. In this case, because the courts said that there was a lack of so-called judicially manageable standards. Exactly how do you quantify how much use of political party in your map drawing is too much? The court gave us an elaborate shrug and said, there really is no hard and fast way to say how much is too much. I think there are a lot of dissenting justices and political and legal commentators who would take issue with that, saying that the same techniques that they use to decide how much use of race is too much could be adapted to political gerrymandering, but a majority of the Supreme Court has decided otherwise. Now, there are some legal requirements for gerrymandering. So at the federal level, you've got your one person, one vote requirement. Now that means that districts have to be substantially equal in population. And the Supreme Court rule about that actually came out of two cases which originated in Tennessee. Baker v. Carr, which actually originated out of the Memphis or the Shelby County Commission, which I used to be a member of, and Reynolds v. Sims, both of them dealing with the state legislative plan in Tennessee. And I think the idea behind this is fairly intuitive. If you have one state legislative district that has 100,000 people in it, and another that has 10,000 people in it, clearly, if you want to have the maximum impact on your election as a voter, you'd rather be in the 10,000 person district because mathematically, your vote's going to count as a greater percentage of the overall vote. But if you're in the 100,000 person district, your vote is diluted. Mathematically, it doesn't count as much. So that's what one person, one vote means. Under prevailing case law, for state and local districting, the one person, one vote requirement basically says that districts need to be substantially equal. They can vary a little bit, but they can't be more than 10% greater or lower than the so-called ideal district population. So if you take the overall population of the jurisdiction and you divide it by the number of districts, that's your ideal population. You can go up or down by 10%, but not more than that. For congressional districting, it's a more exacting plan. They have to be as nearly equal as possible, and any deviation over 1% will probably get you in trouble. The only other requirement at the federal level is the Voting Rights Act, which is a federal law that says that you have to have, you can't have minority vote dilution. That is to say, you can't draw the districts in such a way that they unfairly minimize the ability of voters of color to elect candidates of choice. So it's basically only for racial and ethnic gerrymandering. And there's a whole line of case law dealing with how you decide when race has been used in such a way as to unfairly dilute minority voting strength. At the state level, there aren't really too many more requirements on top of the federal ones. The state legislature, according to the Constitution, is elected from single-member districts in the House and in the Senate. At the local level, the Constitution also talks about district representation, but those districts can have between 1 and 3 members. So you can have a 2-person district or a 3-person district. All of these districts are, according to state statute, are supposed to be quote unquote reasonably compact, which is not well defined, but it basically means not too oddly shaped, and contiguous, meaning all parts of the district have to touch each other. So you can't have one little sliver of a district on one side of the state and then another part of the same district on the other side of the state without them touching each other. And the statute also talks about avoiding the cutting of precinct lines, but it also allows for doing that where it is necessary to meet the other redistricting criteria.
Professor Mulroy, we do have 2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
One is, it starts with a statement. Rucho means that voters must rely on the partisan politicians to change their gerrymandering habits. That's not going to happen. So is the United States headed the way of Hungary and Poland, with one party legally gaining control and then using increasingly undemocratic, illiberal methods to subvert democracy?
Well, it's possible. It is certainly possible that that could happen. We are the only industrialized democracy in the world that allows politicians to draw their own district lines. Other countries use nonpartisan redistricting commissions to prevent gerrymandering, which I'm going to get to in a moment. It's possible that if the For the People Act were passed, it could mandate the use of nonpartisan redistricting commissions to head that, dark scenario off at the pass. But we're really kind of at a jump ball situation right now. I am somewhat comforted by the fact that federal courts never really have all that aggressively policed partisan gerrymandering throughout our nation's history. And although partisan gerrymandering has been a severe problem throughout our nation's history, the republic still hasn't fallen. We haven't gone the way of Hungary yet. So maybe we can circle back to that when I'm done with the presentation. But I guess my answer is I certainly hope not. And I think there are things that we can do to prevent it.
Second one is, and you may be going to be talking about this later, is to what extent can ranked choice voting mitigate the effects of gerrymandering?
Who asked that question?
Jack McFadden.
Well, God bless you. That is exactly what I want to talk about. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to get to it in a minute. Okay, so as I just mentioned a second ago, my computer is freezing up, so bear with me for a second. One proposal that has come up is the use of nonpartisan redistricting commissions to actually do the drawing of the district lines to prevent the gerrymandering problem that we have, since the courts, in most cases, won't really be able to prevent the gerrymanders, or if they can, they'll only be able to prevent the most extreme and obvious of the gerrymanders. I apologize. I've got this little rotating circle that means that the computer is in the process of processing my command here. I'm trying to advance the slide and it seems to be hung up on me. Just bear with me for a second. I've just tried to stop sharing the PowerPoint and see if I can start up again and see if that helps. But even that isn't working. Well, I'll tell you, while I'm waiting for the technology to catch up with me, I'll just have to proceed from memory here, and I apologize if what I'm talking about won't match what you're looking at. But as I mentioned before, we are the only industrialized democracy that allows the politicians to draw their own district lines. Every other industrialized democracy has, over the years, eventually evolved to a situation where nonpartisan redistricting commissions do the districting lines. Now, sometimes they are yeah, interesting. Things are changing here. Sometimes they're bipartisan, which they have politicians, but there's an equal number of elected officials on them at all. Australia is a good example of this. They have demographers and political scientists and experts who are not affiliated with either party that are appointed to be a non-political commission that does the districting every 10 years. There we go. Now, this model has been applied in a few US states in recent years. California has done it. Iowa has done it. A number of different states, they've appointed either bipartisan or nonpartisan redistricting commissions, and they have had some success. They've definitely made things better. So I would definitely recommend that where we are drawing district lines, we use nonpartisan redistricting commissions to do them. But because of the phenomenon of demographic clustering that I talked about, I'll talk about in a moment, even the most well-intentioned nonpartisan redistricting commission can only improve things so much. So, for example, in recent decades, hold on one second. Can everyone see this, the PowerPoint right now?
No.
Okay, but you could before, right?
Yes.
Okay. Then let me try sharing it again.
Exactly.
Okay, now we can see it?
Yes, yes,
All
we
right.
can.
All right, I don't know what was going on there. It just sort of suddenly froze up, but that's okay. Okay. So different studies in the last decade or two have showed that the partisan bias, the skew, the deviation between the percentage of votes that a party gets and the percentage of seats that they are awarded in the districting plan, that partisan bias has reduced significantly. But it's still there. It's still at about a 5% partisan bias level. And the reason that is the case is something called demographic clustering, also called the big sort. Since World War II, we've had a slow motion in migration in this country, with people sort of sorting themselves by their ideological preference. Basically, left-leaning voters, Democrats, are over-concentrating in coastal cities, while Republican voters are moving to the suburbs or to rural areas. And as a result, if you are forced to overlay a single member district construct on top of this demographic sorting, you are going to underrepresent the people that over-concentrate in the cities and overrepresent the people in the rural areas. Now, this happens all the time in the US Senate, where a state like Wyoming will get the same kind of representation as a state like New York or California, because every state gets 2 senators. That definitely has a skew towards rural, less populated states, which in the current political climate means a rightward skew. Well, something similar is happening because of the big sort. Even when you have nonpartisan redistricting commissions doing their best to minimize that skew. Here's a sort of a nice clean example of what we're talking about. People may have seen this diagram before. Take a look over here on the left side of the screen. We've got a 60% blue, 40% red population with 5 districts. You would think that would mean that there would be 3 blue districts and 2 red districts if it was proportional. Over on the far right is an obvious gerrymander, right? The districts are clearly oddly shaped. They are packing the blue districts into the blue voters into 2 districts so that the red ends up getting a majority, even though they're only 40% of the vote. This is an obvious gerrymander. A less obvious gerrymander is this one right here. This is kind of like the Wisconsin districting. The districts don't look oddly shaped, but you still end up getting a bad result, because in this case, the majority party sweeps and the minority party doesn't get any representation, right? Now that's not fair either. Now this one over here is supposed to be the perfect representation. You see how you've got proportional representation, you've got 3 blue districts to 2 red districts, and they're all nice and compact. But I would say that even this isn't really good, because you never have 100% of anything. So the few blue voters in a red district and the few red voters in a blue district, they're not getting any representation, right? They might as well not even show up, right? It's like a Democratic voter in Mississippi or a Republican voter in California or Massachusetts, right? They are adrift in a single member district construct where they know that their vote really won't matter. I don't think this is actually very good either. But it does show you that even if you have nice compact lines, and even if you have a nonpartisan redistricting commission doing their best to minimize the skew, demographic clustering is going to cause a bit of a skew. And that's inherent in the nature of winner-take-all elections in single-member districts. Winner-take-all means that 50.1% of the vote gives you 100% of the power. And even a significant minority goes away taking nothing, feeling alienated from the process. They just throw up their hands and say, what's the point? My vote never counts anyway. This should be a familiar feeling to a lot of you. I think a lot of you have had that feeling over the years where, you're a Democrat in a Republican district, or you're a Republican in a Democratic district, and you say, well, why do I even bother, right? The solution, many people, including myself, would say, is that of proportional representation. Under proportional representation, if you've got 30% of the jurisdiction is of a particular race or a particular political party, and they tend to vote the same way, they should get roughly, give or take, 30% of the power, right? Not all of the power, and certainly not a majority. The majority should always get a majority of the power, but the majority shouldn't sweep and completely shut out the minority. And when I say the minority, I'm referring to a racial or ethnic minority where voting is racially polarized, and we're talking about minority vote delusion, or a partisan minority in a partisan election, or an ideological minority in a nonpartisan election. It really doesn't matter. So a majority of the votes under PR, proportional representation, gets a majority of the seats. Significant minorities are not shut out. And every election is competitive, because you don't have the sense of, well, I'm a blue voter in a red district. I can't possibly win, so I might as well stay home. Depending on whether you and like-minded voters mobilize and turn out at the polls, you can make the difference between getting, let's say, one district out of 5 or 2 districts out of 5. And since every election is competitive, you have higher participation. Also, as an empirical matter, wherever proportional representation has been used, and it has been used all throughout the world, every industrialized democracy elects at least one branch of its national legislature using a PR system, except for the United States and Canada. And it's been used widely throughout the United States as well. Wherever it's been used, women get elected in higher proportion to their numbers as the voters. You know, they're more than half the voters, and yet they're far less than half of the elected officials, except in PR systems where it ends up being somewhat proportional. Australia, where I studied and wrote my book, is a really good experiment here. They elect their house, their national house, through single member districts, and they elect their Senate through proportional representation. So you've got decade after decade the same voters and the same the same parties competing in the same political environment side by side. So all the variables, are held constant, except for whether you're using winner-take-all single-member district versus PR. And decade after decade, the Senate has had more proportional representation. In other words, the percentage of votes nationwide that the party gets is more closely aligned to the percentage of seats that they get than in the House. The Senate also has more proportionality and more opportunity for third parties. So the Green Party, which represents about 10% of the vote in Australia, gets, guess it, roughly 10% of the seats in the Senate, but 0% in the single member district winner-take-all House. The Senate also has a higher percentage of women. There are more female senators than there are female House members, even though they're the same voters and the same attitudes about gender. And their nonpartisan redistricting commission experience is also instructive. They kind of have the gold standard for the nonpartisan redistricting commissions globally. Extremely well respected, extremely competent, and scrupulous about trying to be fair. And yet, several times over the last couple of decades, they have had a counter-majoritarian anomaly, where the party that got a majority of the votes didn't get a majority of the seats. And that's just because of what I'm talking about, the natural gerrymander of a single member district system. All right, well, how could this come to the United States? Is there a way that it could happen in the United States? Yes, there's a bill in Congress called the Fair Representation Act that already has a fair number of co-sponsors that would call for this. It would allow states to opt to experiment with proportional representation in the way that they elect people to the US House. And the way it works would be, you would use, someone asked before about ranked choice voting. Here's where the ranked choice voting comes in. You would use a ranked choice voting system called the single transferable vote that reaches proportional representation outcomes. So districts, the states could opt to, rather than having a single member district with a winner-take-all system, to have multi-member districts of anywhere between 3 to 5 members. These districts would be drawn by a nonpartisan redistricting commission. And then you would have a ranked choice voting proportional representation election within each district. Now, ranked choice voting can sound a lot more complicated. It actually isn't. What all the voter needs to do is to be able to go into a voting booth and say, here's my first choice. If I can't have them, here's my second choice. And if I can't have them, here's my third choice. You can use ranked choice voting to elect one person, like to elect one mayor or one person in a single member district. And that's called instant runoff voting. But you can also use ranked choice voting to in an election where you're electing a number of people to a legislature, 3 people at once or 5 people at once. And when you do it that way, you achieve proportional results. So if a particular, let's say, racial minority is 20% of the vote and they're politically cohesive, they tend to vote the same way, but they're always being shut out by the majority. In a 5-member district, if they're 20% of the vote, they will get 1 out of those 5 seats if you used single transferable vote, that form of ranked choice voting. Let's see, I don't have a slide for this, but I should say that ranked choice voting whether you're talking about a proportional representation system, when you're electing 3 to 5 members from a district, or when you're just electing one person, one mayor or one person of in a single member district, ranked choice voting itself has a real advantage. And one of the advantages, it prevents the spoiler problem. So we've all seen a situation where, you know, let's say it's a Republican majority district, but too many Republicans are running and they split the Republican vote. And as a result, one Democrat can get elected with, you know, let's say 35% of the vote if you don't have a majority requirement, right? That's the spoiler problem, the vote splitting problem. Now, one of the ways that people try to prevent that from happening is to have a separate runoff election a month or two after the main election. The problem there, though, is that turnout usually declines in that runoff election, and turnout declines particularly among lower income people, minorities, you know, basically the people that have a difficult time managing all of the hurdles of, you know, getting to the polls, taking time off from work, and that kind of thing. It's also expensive to hold these runoff elections. So ranked choice voting in that context has that advantage of saving time, saving money, boosting turnout, and also preventing the spoiler problem. One other thing that ranked choice voting does, which is very helpful, is it discourages negative campaigning. So for example, if Marianne and I are competing as candidates against each other in a ranked choice voting election, I want to be the first choice of my own base, but I also would like to persuade voters to make me the second choice of Marianne's base. So I'm more incentivized to be cooperative in my campaigning rather than negative. So I'm not going to run that ad that says Marianne beats her husband and Marianne cheats on her taxes, don't vote for Marianne, because I don't want to alienate Marianne's base. I want them to make me their second choice. So ranked choice voting tends to lead to the election of candidates who have a broad consensus, candidates who try to market themselves to the broadest coalition of voters and who don't engage in negative campaigning. Now, obviously, if you take all of those advantages of ranked choice voting, and then you add on top the advantages of proportional representation, like in the single transferable vote, then you have even more advantages. Because by being proportional, the majority always controls the majority. You don't have counter-majoritarian anomalies. It's a more accurate reflection of the popular will. And it also discourages the extreme polarization that we have had in recent decades. Right now, with single-member districts and gerrymandering, almost all the districts are guaranteed Republican or guaranteed Democratic. So the general election is really an afterthought. The only true competition comes in the primary election, which themselves on the left in the Democratic primary, and everyone is trying to outdo themselves on the right in the Republican primary. So you have extremists from both sides who eventually get elected, and then they have no incentive to work across the aisle. Their only incentive is to avoid being primaried. So each one of them sticks to the most extreme version of their party's position, and you get gridlock. Again, I think what I'm describing probably should sound familiar to a lot of you. Proportional representation ends that perverse incentive, and it also ends gerrymandering because you're not really drawing districts, or you're only drawing a few larger multi-member districts. And the fewer districts you draw, the fewer opportunities there are for gerrymandering mischief. You are avoiding the natural gerrymanders, the accidental gerrymanders that come from the big sort and demographic clustering. Okay, so clearly gerrymandering, you know that I think it's a problem, and you know that I think that nonpartisan redistricting commissions are part of the solution. I'm arguing that because of demographic clustering and all these other things I've talked about, Nonpartisan redistricting is not the total solution. It's part of the solution, but we should also be considering proportional representation and multi-member districts, getting away from a winner-take-all 100%, 0% construct for all of the reasons that I just described. Well, are there problems with this? What's the downside to this? What are the objections to these reform proposals? Well, one of them is that ranked choice voting is confusing and it's difficult to administer. You hear this all the time. It's hard enough to educate voters to go to the polls and vote for one person. Educating them to vote for their first choice and then their second choice and then their third choice. Basically, American voters are just too dumb for that. I understand the objection, but obviously I disagree. There have been over 200 ranked choice voting elections in the United States in the last couple of decades. It has been adopted in a dozen different cities throughout the country, and the entire state of Maine uses ranked choice voting now. The entire state of Alaska has recently moved to ranked choice voting. And where these elections have occurred, there has not been massive voter confusion. Surveys of voters have said that they found it easy to rank. They didn't find it too confusing to use, or vast majorities of voters said so, 70 or 80%. And 70 or 80% of the voters do in fact rank. They do rank a first and second and third choice, showing that they understand how the system works. Now, I know that explaining the counting process and how election administrators actually administer ranked choice voting elections could be complicated, but the average voter doesn't need to know that. Just like the average voter doesn't need to be able to understand the intricacies of the Electoral College in order to vote in a presidential election. Neither does a voter have to understand all those intricacies in order to be able to walk into a voting booth and effectively use their ranked choice voting ballot. An objection to proportional representation is that it avoids local representation. So if you start to have larger multi-member districts taking up larger sections of the city or the county or the state, rather than small neighborhood-based single-member districts, you're avoiding, the charm of local representation. Now that's true, and it boils down to what's more important: having local representation, using geography as the basis of your representation, or having representation that accurately reflects the partisan, ideological, racial preferences of the overall populace. I would say that the second is more important than the first, but even if you disagree, the beauty of PR is it's so flexible. If you are a voter in a PR jurisdiction and it's more important to you to have a representative who lives in your neighborhood than a representative who thinks like you on taxation and LGBTQ rights and foreign policy, well, then you can always vote for the person that lives near you, right? No one's forcing you to go in any one direction. Whereas single-member districts do sort of force you. You're penned into one district where your options are more limited. Another objection that you hear from time to time is that proportional representation can lead to the election of so-called fringe candidates. So think, the far-right extremists in Israel, or the far left extremists in some of the European countries. Yeah, but the problem there is those systems are designed where even 1 or 2% of the vote can get somebody elected to the parliament. We don't have to do that. What political scientists call the threshold of exclusion. What's the minimum percentage of the vote that you need to elect one person? You can set it at whatever level you want. I personally think that the some level of vote, 15, 20%, once you get into that range, once you have a candidate that commands 15 to 20% of the vote, then by definition, they're no longer fringe. However much you may disagree with them, they deserve a seat at the table. And of course, all of this, there's an objection about it being politically unfeasible. And, a couple of decades ago, I might have agreed with that criticism. But in the last couple of decades, we've gone from a handful of cities and counties using these kinds of systems in the United States to dozens and dozens. We've had hundreds of ranked choice voting elections. As I said before, entire states like Maine and Alaska have gone over to ranked choice voting. The type of proportional representation system that I'm talking about, where you use the multi-member districts and ranked choice voting to get proportional results, has been used successfully in Cambridge, Massachusetts for over 50 years, and in Minneapolis, Minnesota for over 20 years. And the overall trend is definitely towards ranked choice voting and proportional representation. You know, the trend lines are definitely more and more in that direction. So while I would still say it's an uphill battle, I don't think it's an impossible battle. And again, I'm not saying these things are going to happen overnight. I do think that nonpartisan redistricting commissions are necessary and are part of the solution to our gerrymandering problem, because the courts really aren't going to save us. But I do think that because of demographic clustering, we've got to go beyond, we've got to think beyond nonpartisan redistricting commissions and think outside the box for more creative solutions like the ones that I'm talking about. I'll conclude here and give time for comments and discussion. One of the things that I do with my students is I'm a big fan of limericks, and I try to end each class session with a limerick, which tries to sort of capture the overall essence of the lesson. So I'll do that here today. And like I said, a lot of these ideas are in my book, but I try to adapt them to our Tennessee experience and update them for recent developments. So overall, I'll say that from winner take all, take a breather. Single districts? No, not them neither. PR and RCV we could do to eliminate the skew, and it wouldn't hurt to buy my book either.
Thank you so much, Stephen. We really appreciate that. And I am monitoring the chat box right now. Please put your questions in the chat box.
You know, I can't actually see the comments. They're kind of like cut off on my computer. Like Norma Shirk
Yeah.
wrote partisan politicians to change there, and then it cuts off.
Okay, here we go. Have any southern states implemented RCV or PR systems?
An excellent question. Tennessee is the beachhead. Tennessee is ground zero for this fight. It's the only southern state that has tried to experiment it. So voters in Memphis, where I'm from, in 3 different referendum elections over the space of 12 years, keep saying they want to try ranked choice voting in their single member district city council races. The state of Tennessee coordinator of elections has said, incorrectly in my view, that it's illegal under Tennessee law. There really isn't any specific part of Tennessee law that would prevent it. It's, in my view, about the strained interpretation of Tennessee law. So we're currently in court fighting with them for the right to implement the ranked choice voting election that that Memphis voters have voted for overwhelmingly in 3 separate referenda. Nashville, the Metro Council, pushed for it as well, and they came very close to getting the 2/3 majority they needed in order to put such a referendum on the ballot for Nashville, for Metro Nashville. They got well over a majority of the Metro Council, but not quite the 2/3 they needed. They are most likely going to try again, but I think they're kind of waiting for the outcome of the court decision. You know, we're still fighting in the state in court, trying to get permission to go ahead and implement our ranked choice voting experiment in Memphis. I will say that while ranked choice, I should also say, I should have mentioned this, ranked choice, there have been ranked choice voting elections that occurred in North Carolina. I forgot to mention that. There have been a number of ranked choice voting elections that occurred in North Carolina. And there are 5 southern states that use ranked choice voting for their overseas ballots. You know how military people and residents living overseas, they're entitled under federal law to get their ballots mailed to them in advance, so they have time to fill them out and participate in elections. It's a law that's called UO-CAVA that guarantees that. And there are 5 southern states that use ranked choice voting for their UO-CAVA voters as well. So it's not unheard of in the South. And the idea of non-district elections using other methods of voting like cumulative voting and limited voting, that has been used for decades throughout the South in dozens and dozens of local elections in Alabama and North Carolina.
Thank you. Another question, where can you buy his book? It's very expensive on Amazon.
Well, it should be the case that you can get it on paperback now at Amazon. So I don't know what you think expensive is, but the paperback I think is $30.
Okay. Someone asked, can we get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation? Yes, that will be on the League's website. Another question, I understand that New York City is going to use the ranked choice voting model in the mayoral election. I also understand that there are some concerns about this. What do you know?
Some minority representatives, like persons of color who are elected officials, have raised concerns because they think that it'll be too confusing for minority voters, and that minority voters will be disadvantaged in the ranked choice voting election. Again, I can tell you that there's been many studies on this, and ranked choice voting, where it's been used, has resulted in an increase in minority representation, and minority voters have not reported that they are confused with ranking their first, second, and third choices. So although there has been a little bit of pushback from that quarter, they're still going forward with ranked choice voting elections this month in their city primary elections.
Okay, what are some suggestions for convincing our elected representatives to change the system?
That's the toughest thing at all. I've often said that election reformers go into election reform out of masochism, because it's so hard to convince incumbent politicians that they need to change the very system that brought them to power in the first place. And we saw that in Memphis. The Memphis City Council, whether you were Republican or Democratic, black or white, they all were united in trying to fight ranked choice voting, because they correctly saw that it made elections more competitive, and no one wants to change the system that brought them to power. It's a slow process. I think that ranked choice voting in particular has some appeal that crosses party lines and race lines. Everyone likes higher turnout. No one likes negative campaigning. No one likes unnecessarily expensive elections. So sometimes those kinds of arguments can be effective. And I think that everyone understands the appeal of, when you're in the minority, Democrats are the majority in Memphis, but the minority in Tennessee, and currently the majority at the federal level, but that can change. Everyone's a minority somewhere. And so maybe you can argue, the fairness of PR is that the minorities don't get completely shut out.
Given the political environment in Tennessee, what is possible at the state level in the upcoming redistricting activity?
Not a lot. You have a Republican supermajority that is, I think, determined to, maximize their advantage in the upcoming redistricting, just like they did in the 2010 round of redistricting. So I think the best thing to do is, like organizations like the LWV, I think are going to be crucial, because they have credibility as being nonpartisan, and they need to call out the first of all, make sure the process is transparent. There are websites now that allow anybody or any organization to come up with their own redistricting plans that they think are fair. We need to fight to make sure that the process is transparent. come up with our own non-gerrymandered plans and force the decision makers to publicly explain why they're not adopting them, and just try to use, public pressure and shame to prevent the worst of the gerrymandering excesses. But I think a certain amount of gerrymandering excess is probably going to be unavoidable. And I also think that there's going to be a role for the courts. I think that you'll probably see, litigation on this upcoming round of redistricting.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you know where the governor of Tennessee stands on ranked voting?
I don't. I suspect he probably doesn't know much about it and has never been forced to take a position on it. I would love for someone to ask him and get him to decide. It shouldn't be a partisan issue. Republicans in Utah recently adopted it, and now many cities in Utah are opting in. The Republican Party in Alaska has supported it. But for some reason in Tennessee, I think you're going to have more opposition from Republicans, and I think it's just sort of an inherent resistance or clinging to the status quo and a skepticism about change. But I'm hoping that's wrong. It really shouldn't be a partisan issue.
Thank you very much. Our bookworm has asked, thanks for the answer, read the book. Hardback was $105.
Yeah, I know. Well, see, that was an academic publication, and the academic publications are being sold to law schools and colleges, and they're always very expensive. And I really didn't like that when I found that out. And so that I pushed them to get the paperback released as soon as possible, because I do want the average person to be able to read it as well. And so I think the paperback's way more reasonable in price.
Great. We have a question here, is how can we have more of a voice in local redistricting? We do have several local leagues that are working on local redistricting in their area.
I think the LWV is uniquely positioned to have credibility as a nonpartisan good government group. The LWV needs to partner with Common Cause and other types of groups that are like that, and come up with your own plans. I mean, these new websites now, it makes it so easy. It's so user-friendly. You can draw your own redistricting plans, and then demand that they have public hearings on redistricting that are open and transparent, and then demand that they explain why they're adopting their preferred plan over the Common Cause or LWV or whatever good government plan. I think I'm more optimistic about your ability to influence the drawing of district lines on the local level than I am on the state level. I think there's real opportunities there.
Thank you. Part of our plans that we have is, in addition to these webinars, we are having some college students at TSU draw some independent maps for us, which we plan on presenting to the legislature.
Good.
Yeah, and we are working with some of the legislators themselves to, as you said, demand more public input and transparency. Don't know how far we'll get, but that's what we're doing. Okay. Any more questions? I guess that's it. Thank you so much, Stephen. We really enjoyed this. It was extremely enlightening, and it certainly gives us a perspective that we haven't been looking at before. We have heard, of course, about the ranked choice voting and proportional representation, but this was such great information as to how that works and that it can work for everyone. So I'm going to turn this back over to Debbie.
Thank you.
And thank you. This has really been really informative, and you make me feel optimistic that sometime in the future that we'll actually feel that we have a process for electing our government that really represents everyone. So we really appreciate this, and we will certainly want to keep you informed as we move forward. And we certainly hope if you have great ideas in the middle of the night about how we can have a greater impact, we'd always love to hear them. So we very much appreciated.
You're welcome, and will do.
Thank you.
Thank you. So thanks for everyone for joining us today. And again, if you need to find this, it will be on our website later this week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care now.